Welcome, everyone. Today's episode is one that I've been looking forward to for a while. I highly admire the person that I have the joy of interviewing today. He's asked me to call him Stan, so I will call him Stan throughout this interview, but I think it's worth noting what he's achieved in his life. Stan spent the last 34 years, or at least 34 years in the Army, commanding at the 4-star level. He spent it, in the last decade or so in the Iraq and Afghanistan theaters, and he received many recognitions and awards for it. In particular, one that I think is worth name checking, which is the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, from what I understand, is the highest honor you can receive, or at least one of the highest one you can receive. And since he's left the armed forces, he's stayed busy in helping distribute a lot of what he's learned during his time there. He founded a successful firm, the McChrystal Group, and he's helping other people, such as large corporates and startups and everything in the middle, in understanding leadership better. He's written 4 books. I've read at least 2.5 of them. And he's got a 5th one coming out next year, which he might mention some of the elements of it. And he's taught leadership at Yale. And as I mentioned before, he's been on the board of various companies. A resume that has had to been reduced because I was tempted to go much longer. But with that brief introduction, welcome, Stan.
Well, thanks so much, Carlos. And if I was going to add additional things to my resume, I've been married to the same gal who I love for 47 years. I've got 3 granddaughters, and they live next door to me.
That's amazing.
So my life's pretty good.
That's great. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I just got married last year, so hopefully I'll catch up at some point. Well, today we're going to be focusing largely on a few ideas born out of your book, Leaders, which is available on Amazon. Sorry about the blurring, guys, but you can kind of see what it is. I will weave in a little bit about Team of Teams throughout the interview, but we'll focus on that mostly. And you suggested that I ask you one question to kick things off, and I actually reflected on it. I think it's a very, very good place to start. And it's, how did writing this book, which you used to talk about the stories of many distinguished people throughout history, including the likes of Walt Disney all the way to Robespierre, how did this book shape your conclusions about leadership? And how did these differ from what you had been taught throughout your career?
Yeah, Carlos, thanks for having me on and for the thoughtfulness that this conversation I know will contain. I had spent a lifetime being trained, educated, and shaped to be a leader, from school on sports teams and whatnot, and then West Point, where that's the goal. And you are around iconic leader figures, whether living or dead, and you are hopefully going to turn out to be an effective leader. And there are different techniques they did. We studied history, we got leadership checklists, we did all these different things. And what I found is you'd think that at the end of that experience, my 34 years in the Army, that I would therefore be a finished leader. Like the end of the assembly line, okay, I figured it out. I could read a book about leadership that says, okay, here's the deal. This is how you lead. But the reality is I couldn't. What I had found in my life is that there were many theories about leadership. We've been studying it forever. And most of them have great value, but none are complete. And they never meshed with my experience. And I use in the book, I describe, for example, the penultimate leader at West Point when I was there was Robert E. Lee. He was former superintendent. He had been a hero in the Mexican War. He was a very effective general on the Confederate side against the United States during the Civil War. I lived in Lee Barracks. He was almost like an aura that was around West Point. Nobody tried to be Robert E. Lee because it would be arrogant to think you could do that. But everybody could use him as a distant aiming point that you would guide for. And yet, in the most difficult period of the life, the Civil War, he lost to Sam Grant, Ulysses Grant, who had been low in his class at West Point, sort of a disheveled guy he left the military with problems as a young officer. Then he had struggled in civilian life. Then during the Civil War, he turns out to be extraordinarily effective. Now, in many ways, they did share a lot of good attributes of leadership, but in many ways, they were very different, and yet Grant wins. Now we can make it simplistic. We can say, no, Grant won because the United States had more economic power and whatnot. It's much more complicated than that. The reality is that the very normal or traditional heroic view of leaders, where we take this person with the physical and mental and moral things, we put them on a pedestal and we worship them, is just not right. It's incomplete. And what we find is there's much more to it. And so this book became part of my study and reflection of that. And it made me realize that leadership is really this intersection of factors. It's the leader themselves, it's the followers, or really the people that they are working with, and it's the context of the moment. And all of those have maybe equal impact on what comes out. And so it makes it constantly alive and organic and never completely predictable.
Yeah, that's a very good way of breaking it down. I think it's the necessary bubble popping moment of anybody who's a student of this, because it stops you from latching onto an idea of perfection in a leader and makes you have to rethink the ideas and the zeitgeist that they were living in that made them successful. And it's easy to sort of think about that when we're talking about somebody in history like Robert Lee, but it gets even harder when you start looking at closer history like Steve Jobs. A lot of founders like to think that there are some attributes that they can replicate, but there is a context. And if you look at some of the famous Apple commercials of 1984 and breaking the mold and all these things, it was the context that enabled that style of leadership to exist. And perhaps it's less effective now when everyone's cloning it and everybody's wearing a turtleneck when they're presenting, right? So I wanted to play with this idea a little further and have you walk us through a key element that is interwoven through your book, which is this idea of the three myths. And it's tied to this idea of not only there being like a heroic view of leaders, the context and the followers, but these are very distinct from the three myths that apply to them.
Yeah, we tend to think, you talk about one is the results myth, and that is the idea that great leaders get great results and that the results can be attributed to the leader. And if you look in corporate world right now, that's sort of the way we compensate CEOs. We bring a CEO in, and if the company succeeds, we pour money on them. And if the company fails, we don't. But the reality is they sometimes got on an up elevator. And also sometimes the best, most effective, most moral leaders, other factors just determine what happens. So if you try to connect the idea that the leader is the penultimate reason for success or failure, I think it's too narrow a focus. We sometimes talk about, if you go to a play, they put in a biography does the same thing. You put a spotlight on a single individual and you watch everything they say and do. Everybody else is sort of in the shadows. But we know from real organizations that it is the team around people that often do a tremendous amount of what happens or doesn't happen. So that's part of it. I think that we also think that the characteristics of a leader are what's going to make the difference. If the person is thrifty, brave, clean, reverent, they're going to be successful. But the reality is when we study hard at many of the leaders that either have been successful or failed, they violate those just almost violently. And most turn out to be a little bit of both. We take a leader that is very successful, a political leader, take President Clinton, very successful in many ways, and yet proved to have flaws in personal morality that really bother a lot of people. And that duality, I think, exists in everybody. We want to pretend it doesn't. We want to stand on the pedestal and tell people that we are the whole package and perfect. But the reality is it's just not. So these myths are things that we just habitually follow, and yet they turn out, in my experience, to be wrong.
There's a last one, which is, and to some extent, you talked about it, the attribution myth. And I'm left thinking about the point that you made earlier about followers being a huge enabler for a leader to exist. In many ways, making them complicit in this illusion of the results. Like the leader believes they draw the results, the larger audience gives the credit to the leader. The followers are complicit in this relationship because they're enabling the leader to have that. And it sort of begs this question of how do you break that cycle? Because it when it goes well, it can look good, right? But when it doesn't go well, you talk a little bit about with Walt Disney, like early Walt Disney versus late Walt Disney. Early Walt Disney, this cycle went well, which led to the birth of what we now know as Walt. But towards the end, when you're talking about it in your book, it sort of started becoming toxic. And so, how do you break this cycle of sort of complicitness?
Yeah, it's a great point because if you go into the early Disney period, when he formed this team, and he was a key driver of this, he was a visionary and he was energy that pushed. And so he definitely was a major part of creating what Disney became. But then at a certain point, what happens is it's a system by itself. It's an entity. It's not Walt Disney. It's the Disney company of which he is a part. And if we start to personify everything in that person, one, the organization becomes brittle. They start to wait for what the great woman or man says each day and slavishly follow that. Then of course it becomes slow and ineffective. And of course that person, for lots of reasons, can't continue to have that kind of effect on a big organization. So I think that what you've got to break is the idea that it is all wrapped up in a single person's wisdom or drive. In the larger organizations that I was a part of in the military, my role evolved tremendously from what it had been when I was more junior. When I was more junior, I'm a tactical leader. I'm telling soldiers where to go. I'm telling armored vehicles when to turn left and when to turn right. And then it starts to shift about halfway through my career, noticeably shift. And by the time I'm a senior leader, I am providing a general strategic framework, an overall direction. I'm providing values. This is the way I want this organization to operate. But inside that, the organization has got to do it itself. I don't know enough. I can't stay connected enough. And so my responsibilities aren't less important, but they're less granular. And they are, I am more herding, I'm helping the cattle herd move from point A to point B, but each part of the herd is doing what it wants to do internal in there. And I think a lot of leaders don't accept that evolution.
Yeah. I think it's probably worth noting, and I'd love to have you kind of repeat any anecdotes that you wrote in the book or others that you've seen. It's interesting when you articulate that evolution of your early days leadership to the latter roles you had where you're providing strategy, values, direction. And that resembles the archetype of a servant leader. And it's a very benevolent view of what a leader should do. And yet, in some of the case studies in the book, you also showcase how very harsh and how very mercurial some of the leaders were and were still successful. And one of the conclusions in the book, and I'd love for you to sort of walk through an example that comes to mind when you, whether it be from the book or from real life, it's that many times, as long as there's a form of meaning being provided, there's a tolerance for that. And if the context is the right context, that tolerance is a function of that context. It might be that you're, in a conflict or in a war or in a depression, and therefore there's an additional tolerance for that context. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's a causality. If you are like an Elon Musk character, you will be successful. And maybe you can opine on that or share any anecdotes there.
Yeah, it's a great description because I'll start first on the tolerance of followers or members of an organization. Most people want to be part of a successful organization. If it's a civilian company, they want something that is profitable so they can continue to have a job and be paid. If it is military, so you survive and you win. There's always a difference, but you're willing to tolerate an awful lot if you feel like your overall basic needs are being met. We look at Adolf Hitler. For the early years of his leadership, of course, it was clear that he had become a dictator, but Germany climbed out of the Depression. Germany rearmed. Germany was successful in the first parts of the Second World War. And so the reality was he was very popular in Germany. He was actually popular until the day he was killed, even though he had brought the nation to ruin, because there was a tolerance, and over time that meshes with a sort of a faithful belief. What I find is leaders get confused on that. And what that means is, as a leader starts to think that if people will tolerate what I'm doing, that may mean because I'm right, or because I'm good, or because I'm special. And so I think that the components of that, first off, you've got to figure out what your followers need from you. What is it you are delivering for them? Because they're not automatons just doing what you want for no reason. They have made a choice normally to follow you or not follow you. So you got to figure out what in that span is important to them. And that evolves over time. I think you've also got to understand that the limits of your ability to either be wise or be right or any of those things is much more limited than we think it is. Individuals, we read Fortune magazine and we see a CEO and they say, the story says he's or she's involved in every aspect of the company. They can spout off all the numbers. They've got mastery of that. And we think, well, boy, I ought to be able to do that. And the reality is most of us can't do that. And even if we could, it would take so much of our effort that it would take away from the things we probably ought to be doing. What we really should be doing at more senior levels is enabling and helping the people below us be as effective in their sphere as they can. And that takes leaders being mature about their role, being thoughtful about what is it I actually do here? What's my contribution?
On that point, you conclude in the last chapter of your book on this idea, which is what you just mentioned of servant leadership, but that there might be a slightly, and I don't think you intended it to sound dystopian, but this idea of a post-leadership age where maybe systems take over people. And maybe you can just unpack, what do you think the evolution of leadership is going to look like in the next decade? We were chatting briefly before the podcast started about the role of AI in training leaders because they can engage with AI models of avatars of historic characters. But where is this? What did you mean when you meant systems in a post-leadership age?
Yeah, Carlos, thanks for hitting that, because I've been doing some work with AI for the last few years and thinking a lot about this. I think first is, before AI, but in the modern information age, we have sped up the time in which other forces impact on us, all of us, whether we're senior leaders or not. Social media, normal media, all of these things. So a leader now gets a level of scrutiny with a speed that almost nobody felt until very recently. You can literally get cyber gang tackled for something small. And we see this every once in a while. Some unknown person suddenly becomes the focus of this vitriol from people who don't even know them for some small reason and may be entirely wrong. I think that's affected the psyche of all of us. I think we have become more cautious. I think we have become less decisive. We try not to admit that, but I think we have become more worried and looking over our shoulder that at any moment we're suddenly going to be the target of criticism or things like that, which we say doesn't bother us, but of course it does. It bothers us a lot. So that's part of what the information age has done, and the speed at which it happens is frightening. I think the AI part is going to make a lot of things better, obviously, because we'll be faster, we'll be able to know more, we'll be able to think more. But it could also be a crutch. There used to be systems in the Army, processes for planning, and there were checklists to go through how to develop a plan for a military operation. And they were a series of steps, and commanders and the staffs would follow them, and they get a numerical evaluation of various options. And then the commander selects one. And that was always flawed because the number was based entirely upon how you'd weighted the criteria. And the process was not designed to produce the right answer. It was designed to produce the right thinking. so that when you get to that final part, the wisdom of the commander and the people around him could say, okay, we have now illuminated this enough, we've got a right answer. AI offers the opportunity to have this box that says do A. And we won't really understand how they arrived at it. And there's a danger we'll say, well, it's got a lot more access to data than I do. It's got a lot more computing capability. Therefore, I would be accepting great risk not to follow A. And I think that is a great risk to individual leaders in all society.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. But yeah, we're living in interesting times, living in interesting time for sure. Well, one of the things that I wanted to sort of leverage is the second book. Well, I don't know which order you wrote them, but Team of Teams. Was that your second book?
That was the second. My first was my memoir. And then I wrote Team of Teams and then Leaders.
Great. So on your second book, I wanted to go into a little bit because the spirit of the community that Seedcamp represents is around teams, fast growing teams. I You have founders that have global ideas and vision, but really supplemented by those early believers that help them scale to then what eventually become world changing companies. And in your book, Team of Teams, I'm going to read some of the 10 little components that obviously there's multiple chapters based on these, but it's just so that those that haven't read the book have a general sense for it. And you talk a little bit about some things that in startup world are more familiar concepts than maybe perhaps in the corporate world or in larger organizations, but they're still worth calling out. So in no particular order, efficiency isn't enough while you pursue things. Sometimes there's a need to differentiate between things that are complicated and things that are complex. One thing that startups do really well is empowering small teams because they are by default small teams, but making sure that they have a shared consciousness and that they're given a lot of empowerment and trust. You also talk about the emphasis on adaptability over some sort of command and control. And that's a temptation every leader has, is to, especially when you watch a lot of TV and perceptions of leaders. But the value you put on adaptability over this sort of centralized model. And then you also talk about the leadership as a gardener, and you also talk about that in this book, Leader, as sort of somebody who enables things, who's been trusted with the resources to unlock things for those that are part of the organization. You talk about information sharing and the speed for it to happen. You talk about adapting through experimentation, which is intrinsically a very startup thing to do because you're constantly just having a minimum viable product and seeing how that iterates, but you encourage that. And lastly, one thing that I think is undervalued in anybody who takes influence from some of these big unicorn, decacorn founders is the value of empathy and communication. And all these little elements are ones that you bring up in your book. And with that as a backdrop, I wanted to focus on the role of teams in the startup world. And to give you some context for the first question on this, a lot of times founders can be very young when they start their companies. And this checklist of things that I read aren't things that are top of mind or even things they're aware of. So I wanted to understand how you've seen leaders grow in organizations you've been part of, and in some cases where they cannot be easily replaced because of, for whatever reason. How have you seen them evolve and undo those mistakes?
Yeah. Most leaders that start with small organizations, as most careers do, begin in an era or in a environment which they know everybody. The task in front of the team is fairly straightforward. They've got to create something or do something, and they can look people in the eye. They can make that decision. Their own personal conduct is observed often by the team. So much of their leadership is demonstrated by their behaviors. They don't have to talk about it. They act it out. So you start with that and you get very able to be quickly adaptable, focused. And if you want to be very directive, you can, because it's a small enough number of people that you can tell everybody what to do. At a certain point when it grows, and there are a lot of studies, some that say 75 people, some that say 150, but it's really based upon each organization where you don't know everybody. You are not interacting with everybody often enough. And just because they do, organizations break into small teams. because everybody needs a certain scalable size of people that they interact with enough to build trust and familiarity and those things. So now you start from a small organization where every individual almost resembles a team to an organization that's larger. And you get a great big organizations. We are one this, we are one Acme Technology. There's no such thing. There are overarching ideas and goals, but within that organization, there are this community of smaller teams that operate as nodes, cultural nodes, operational nodes, and whatnot. So now the leader is in the position of, okay, how do I get all these different nodes to operate effectively when they don't know each other, or they don't interact often, or their expertise and function is different enough where why would HR ever talk to R&D? That sort of thing. So, but yet you're all trying to accomplish the same general outcome. And the leader finds that the traditional ways of doing that, which we'd go back to Frederick Winslow Taylor and efficiency, or to Alfred Sloan in the 1920s with General Motors, you look at these big organization charts that are daunting, but they're actually brilliant because they have very clear lines of communication, responsibility, accountability. And the theory is if everybody just does their job, the genius who has put together this machine is going to get the output that you need. And that was largely true because the output was fairly constant, and this thing with constant tweaking could function pretty well. Well, that environment's gone. Now things are too fast, too complex versus complicated, meaning too many variables and impossible to predict. So now any organization like that is like a steam engine that's trying to operate at a different RPM every minute, which is impossible for an engine that's designed to be predictable. So leaders have got to say, wait a minute, I can't do what I was trained to do. I can't do what every part of me wants to do, which is control this, micromanage this thing. Instead, I've got to lead it organically, which means I've got to have a light touch on many things that I would like to have a firm grip hold on. And so it starts with the leader. The leader has got, to a great degree, let go. And when I say let go, I don't mean let go and go to the golf course. I mean, back off and keep eyes on, but hands off, and let the organization function. And that's more art than the science that we sometimes thought about traditional management.
Yeah. And I think that let go component can be painful when you see the result of, let's say you've come and you visited your friend who CEO of a company over the last decade. You came in, you saw them in year 2, year 5, year 8, year 10. Year
Right.
2, you saw things that you were like, not so sure this is a good idea, mate, but fine. You kind of took him aside, said you should stop doing that. But he saw some Steve Jobs podcast and decided it was a good idea. Year 5, you come back and visit, and now you're seeing the managers that report to him doing that same behavior. And then you come back year 10 and he's like hired you, McChrystal Group, to help him out. And you see that behavior across the entire thing. He's read your book and he's like, I should have let go, but how do I fix the ship now? Because even though I am wiser because of my insights now, how do I rectify that?
Yeah, I'm going to start with answering that, and I'm going to go back to an experience I had. The first thing is you have got to change. And when you change, you are admitting that what you did before was not right now. And if you use different words, what you did before was wrong. Maybe it wasn't, but people perceive it was. And many leaders can't live with the idea that they were doing something that wasn't the right way. And therefore, changing is difficult because it's an admission of that mistake or that weakness from before. The problem is a much greater mistake is to perpetuate it. And a real sin, in my view, is to do something is wrong. And we have a fair amount of that going on now in society. But the reason I say this is because we are leaders particularly, but everyone responds to stimuli. When I was a young lieutenant, I had a battalion commander who was not very good, but he responded to pain and the absence of pain. And we had maintenance issues in the 1970s Army. And so the division commander says, I'm going to fix maintenance in the division. I'm going to put these checkpoints around the installation. And when a unit's vehicle went through it, we would stop the vehicle and we would inspect it for its maintenance status. And if the unit or if the vehicle was found to be badly maintained, then the commander of that unit would get this harsh letter from the division commander, which nobody wanted to get. So my battalion commander doesn't want to get that letter. So what he does is he says, every vehicle, and we had 120 vehicles in the unit, every vehicle that anyone wants to use has got to be approved personally by me. You had to go up to the headquarters and get him to approve the dispatch, the use of that vehicle, which of course is impossible because he's not always in the office and whatnot. And so what happened was the soldiers in my battalion stopped using the vehicles. They started using their private cars to go do military business because it was too hard to get the vehicles out. Now, the battalion commander didn't get any bad letters, but nor did he or the division commander do anything to make the maintenance in the unit better. And I say that because how many times do we think in an organization, why are we doing something? Like someone says, every travel receipts have got to be reviewed by the CEO of the company because somebody in the past lied on one or cheated. And so the fix was to centralize this thing. And we do away with the symptom of that problem, but we create an entire cultural problem below that is far worse. And this is where leaders have got to start to be mature. When I was leading the counter-terrorist forces, primarily in Iraq, and we got to the point where we were doing this huge number of operations every day, about 30% of our operations failed. And every once in a while, they would fail spectacularly. And I would get a call from four-star general and that sort of thing, literally screaming at me on the phone. The problem is I did understand that if I stopped those calls, I'd have to constrain the unit. I'd have to approve operations, and that just wouldn't work. And so at that point in life, I was willing to go through that. But we've all got those moments where we have to lead differently than we had before. And it can be tough.
It can be tough. Actually, you bring up a good point, and I want to paraphrase what you said, and correct me if you think that I did a disservice. But it sounds like, first of all, there's always going to be, or there's always the risk of there being second order effects to driving change, but not changing is like a sin. And obviously, if you admit that things need to change, there's a risk that you're going to get it wrong. And some of those things that you get wrong will inevitably have second order effects that you might then need to correct, which then brings up the point of if you have no choice, you have to try to do something within the best that you can do in your ability as you develop your own character, which I would love for you to comment on, as it's a precursor to the book that you're going to be launching soon. And this reminds me of Harriet Tubman and one of the little details that you wrote in your book about how she carried a gun. And it partially was to defend those that she was sort of shepherding through the Underground Railroad, but it was also sometimes to aim it at those that were not going to fall in line and were not keeping up because they were putting everyone at risk. So, she had her own mechanisms there, perhaps had a second order effect, unintended, but sometimes it's better than not doing anything.
Yeah, everything you do will have downsides to it, will have flaws. And this is one of the things I see in leaders now. The organization may be suffering for this, and you say, well, I think you need to change. And they go, well, there are risks to changing. And usually I'll be able to point back and I say, well, you're failing now. So it's a much greater risk to try something different that might fail, but you have a probability or at least an opportunity for success. You go back to Harriet Tubman, that's exactly right. Here she is at night going from the north, infiltrating back into the south, primarily into the Maryland area in winter. And she would go through marshy grounds. She would go and she would gather groups of enslaved peoples, and she would offer them the opportunity to be secreted back to the north. Now, that meant walking through swamps, that meant going through checkpoints, getting on trains, all of which were risky for them and frightening, because these are people who typically had been kept enslaved on the same farm or plantation their entire lives. They knew the concept of freedom, but they never lived it. And so she's offering them opportunity, and she's got that gun. On one hand, it reminds them of the dangers that they face, because if she's carrying a gun, she must be admitting it's dangerous to do this. On the other hand, people take counsel of their fears. And every once in a while, you've just got to look people and say, I know this is tough. You have got to do this. And all of us have moments of weakness when we won't do what we know we should do. And we need the people around us that remind us, that sometimes hold us to account to do that.
Seems like a good spot to talk about character. Maybe help us in the audience by how you define character.
Yeah. I think ultimately character is reflected in what you do, in your behavior. Because most of us, if we sit down and have a mental discussion with ourselves, we believe in integrity, we believe in loyalty, we believe in love, we believe in a number of things. And we say, okay, therefore I have character. Then if we step in an out-of-body experience and look at our behavior, sometimes we say, now, wait a minute, and I use an example that may shock some people. You go to an airport and the bags are coming in from a flight, and there's a turnstile in which the bags are coming, and the carousel, and you rush up right next to the carousel and you stand there because you want to get your bag first. Well, nobody behind you can see their bags now. They're trying to jump over you and look around, and there's not room for everybody. Now, your bag's not going to come out any earlier because you're standing close, because the people putting them on the conveyor don't know where you are and don't care. And yet you are being thoughtlessly selfish. You're going up there and you are keeping everybody else's gaze away. If we all backed off 5 or 6 feet, everybody could look, and when they come out, they could retrieve it. Yet if I asked everybody to carousel, are you a selfish person? They go, no, I'm just getting my bag. And so what I'd say is, when we are unconsciously selfish or thoughtlessly cruel, or we rationalize our way into doing something we know we shouldn't, then I think we are reflecting our actual character, because character is a combination of two things. It's a combination of deeply held beliefs, which we call convictions, those things we really believe in, and then our personal discipline to live up to them. And if we lack discipline, we can have all the convictions in the world, but we really don't follow them because we don't have the discipline to do that. And so it's that combination of those two that really reflects our character. And for example, now, if we watch some of the figures that are on television talking about politics, they'll take one side or another, and you look at them in their eyes and you know they don't believe what they're saying. You know that they believe something different, but they have either had pollsters or focus groups say, this is the message that works. And on the one hand, they may rationalize, well, I need to do what works so that I can get in a position of responsibility, so I can do the right thing for the nation. But yet I am willing to be duplicitous in front of people so that I can later do the right thing. And it's more complicated than we want to make it. But the reality is, if we don't have character, we have nothing to fall back on, nothing to moor ourselves to. We simply blow with the winds in any direction, and we are opportunistic for our own either success or survival.
Yeah, that's a great definition. Thank you. And it resembles a return to the era where, you had Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Epictetus all driving for and valuing and prizing the development of character and the discipline that comes with it. And so, in many ways, you talked about it in one of your chapters about how heroic figures go through this journey. But there's a reason why. It's because universally it looks like we do value that as a species. It's something that's intrinsic within us. And I think that's some of the words that you said, was that it's something that all cultures seem to desire, this idea of the edification, the sort of arising of these characters and the development of the character, which then brings me to the next section of some of the questions I wanted to ask you, which were about personal development, because it's now that we've defined it, now we know what it should drive team decisions and organizational decisions. Let's look at the unit, the individual. And maybe let's start with you if you're willing to share. What's your daily routine? I mean, how has that changed over the years? How do you balance this introspective nature that has led to these books with the things that you needed to do as a high stress environment that you operated in, and to mold the person you are today?
Yeah, I'm often asked what the most important attribute of a leader is, and I always respond self-discipline. And I do because I think most of us know what good leadership looks like, and we could list a number of things that we want a good leader to do. The difference is not whether we know to do that or not, it's whether we have the discipline to hold ourselves to that standard. And how many times a day do we treat somebody differently or act differently than we know we should? We may not admit it in the moment, but we know. And so I think self-discipline is the most. I have spent a lifetime trying to increase my own self-discipline so that I can do what I think is right. Then you've got to go back and say, okay, what is right? Because those, we get taught a lot by our parents, we get taught by teachers, we get taught by our religious leaders, whatever. But ultimately, we have got to decide what values we believe in, what our convictions are, what is the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do, how we should conduct ourselves. And that's a journey. For me, I was very much helped by having two great parents. And I tell people this, I never saw either of my parents ever do anything wrong. And I mean, they never took a parking place they shouldn't. They never did a wink and a nod. They never kept extra change back from a person at a store and then told us how clever they were. Now, they may have done things wrong, but I never saw or was aware of it through an entire lifetime. And then I went into the military, which espouses values and character. It doesn't always live up to them, but it constantly reminds you duty, honor, country, and related things. And that's a value. I had a couple points in my life, and some people know about them, where I had major directional changes, inflection points. When I left the military, I left in a controversy and a point of notoriety, and it undercut my confidence in myself as who I was, my effectiveness, and all those things. But the most important thing it did, and I didn't recognize it in the moment, was it made me say, stop. Okay, who do I want to be? And the reason I asked that is because suddenly my name was on the newspaper, on the television every 2 minutes. It only lasts a few days if anybody ever experiences that, so don't worry, it goes away. But it makes you, if suddenly people declare you are one kind of person and it's not good, you have to step back and say, is that me or am I different than that? And if I am different, how am I really different? What am I? And I felt I had to prove to myself and every other person I interacted with, whether I'd known before or not, that I was not that. I was not the caricature. And so it made me think, okay, so what do I want them to think? And it made me think of, what do I want to think about me? What do I think is most important? What are the things that matter? Now, I mentioned my granddaughters. It's intensely important to me. My granddaughters know me well now, but when I'm gone, what will they think about me when they know even more? When they read more, they hear more? How will they judge decisions I made, mistakes I'm responsible for, things like that? How will they contextualize that? I think that journey for me has been really helpful. It hasn't been easy, because when you, starting at age 55, when you question yourself that deeply and that constantly, it's a little bit unnerving, because you say, well, what have I been doing the last 55 years?
Mm.
But I think it's a value. And I feel now that I've written this new book that comes out next year on character, That was an exploration on just a whole range of things about character. What do I think? And I found that forcing myself to write them down forced me to dial in my thoughts. I would ask everybody on this to start by saying, am I an honest person? And force yourself to write 3 paragraphs convincing yourself that you're an honest person, knowing that the person reading it also knows everything you didn't put in those 3 paragraphs. How would you really, what would you write? What's your assessment of you?
Yeah, it's a very deep exercise, and it actually makes me wonder a little bit about how it is that you engage with clients of yours via the McChrystal Group, because I can only assume that people come to you in despair about their organizations and they say, Stan, look, I need help. My company's doing this, it's doing that. And based upon what you just said, you could very well be thinking in your inner monologue that you're the problem, man. And I just don't know how to tell you that before we start engaging. So walk us through a little bit about how do you transpose what you just shared with us onto a new client where you see perhaps the individual leader is the problem. What is it the first thing you do to help them out? How is that journey different, let's say, in the commercial world and the military world? And how is it that you take that transformation for them?
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question, because the first thing is to remember those people are on a leadership journey, just like I took, just like you took. And you don't want to be superior saying, why don't they know that? Because if I put myself back at their age and position, I may well have not been nearly as effective as they are. So the first thing is to ask them, what is it you're trying to do? Where do you think the organization and you as a leader are, and where do you want to get to? And you start to get them to articulate what they think they really believe right would look like. And if they just give you financial outcomes and all, that's one thing. Okay, yeah, but if we're really trying to make the organization function differently and better, try to tease that out of them. And most people have not really spent enough time to be able to articulate it, but it's a good exercise for them to start with. And then the second is to try to get in the organization and see how it operates now. And that means you can't just listen to the leader. They've got one view, but it's always incomplete. But to go inside, and we go inside organizations, and we take a lot of information, do a lot of interviews, do these things, and we come back and we try to paint as accurate a picture as we can of what's really happening. And then what's really happening, we go back to the leaders and we say, this is where the organization really is. This is what they think. And it's not just an engagement survey of whether people are happy. It's much more in-depth and nuanced than that. But this is the real situation. Where do you want it to go? And what would it take to get there? And as you start to do that, we often find that one of the major problems is the most senior leader, or sometimes the senior leadership team. We were working with one company that was struggling, and we had that moment when we got into a room with the top 12 or 15 people, and I drew on a whiteboard a rectangle. I said, that's this room. We've now been with your company for a while. 90% of the problem in this company is in that box in this room right now. It's you. And it's not that you're bad people, or it's not that you don't care, but it is you are the cause of dysfunction. And of course, you have that deep gulp and you assume that as consultants, we're going to be fired in the next 30 minutes. But the reality is, in that case, the leader and the people in the room, they digested it, they pondered whether they accepted what we said, and then they started changing stuff. And we're still close relationship with them to this day because they had the courage to step back and say, all right, if that's even mostly right, what can we do about it? And what do we have to do?
Do you find that exercise also uncovers and resolves some tensions between the sort of the de facto leader and maybe a couple of subordinates that might be either ambitious and want to rise to or something, or whether they fight amongst themselves on who's next and all that? Do you feel like that exercise is a solution for some of these intrinsic ambition problems that sometimes get shaped in organizations, or is that a separate exercise?
It is part of it. It will flesh some of that out. Those things will become increasingly evident. they don't solve that problem, because part of that is only solved between one-on-one discussions between those people, between some transparency on, because often a lot of people see that, but if somebody knows that more people than they think recognize their behavior, and you remind them, hey, everybody thinks you are doing XXX, or many people think that, do you want to address that? Then it works. But now you're getting into very individual responses by leaders. But it's really important to take on, because you can paper over them really easily. You can ignore them. But if you don't put them on the table and talk about them, they don't get better. They don't just go away. I find that addressing them initially is painful, because you're opening this up and suddenly people go, and there's emotion involved. But then they can start to fix them.
Mm. So, having covered not only a long-spanning career serving the U.S. Armed Forces, as well as a lot of companies through the McChrystal Group, you must have accrued a series of moments where you look back and you think, "Oh man, I wish I had not done that." And it doesn't always have to be stuff that has, notoriety in the news or anything, because sometimes it's not about those little things. It's about other sort of betrayals of character. And I wanted to see if you might be willing to share one of your biggest regrets and what you learned from it.
Yeah, I've had a bunch of them, more than I could ever count. I had an individual who had worked for me twice earlier in their career, an Army officer, very good. And we were now both more senior in Afghanistan. And he was a battalion commander in maybe the most difficult part of Afghanistan. And he was doing a magnificent job. And his commander, he was 3 levels below me at that point. His commander said, I need to relieve him of command, which ends his military career. And the issue was over something that was judgment. It was sort of the accusation of improper jokes at a morning operations meeting that were viewed as improper. Well, this is an infantry unit in combat. And so you suddenly say, now what's improper? Because I know we're in a modern world, but the reality is infantry units in combat are pretty basic, primal entities at that point. But anyway, the commander says, I'm going to relieve him of command and end his career. And I didn't agree, and I told him I didn't agree, but I ultimately approved it. I allowed it to happen. And I let down the officer, because the reality is he should have been taken around the corner, grabbed by the scruff of the neck and saying, stop it. Don't do that anymore. Get back to your job and go. But instead, by relieving him for that, we did a disservice to the officer. We were legally right, but it was a disservice. But we also sent a message to everyone in that command that was unintentional, but it was not good. And that is, look, we could be petty even when larger issues are at stake. And I've got a series of those kinds of things when I've either made a decision wasn't right, but more often when I saw something that was wrong, had the power to do something, and I didn't. And I deeply regret those, because you can't undo them. They're.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I have 2 more questions. One of them is serious in this trajectory, and then one of them fun to end with. On this trajectory, you bring up the point of how sometimes you learn from your mistakes, but sometimes you can learn from the mistakes others have made. And that brings up the question of engaging with people you look up to and mentors. And maybe if you can share an anecdote of someone you've learned a lot from, and how did you structure that relationship so that you could learn from them?
Yeah, that's always tricky. People say they got to go find a mentor, but I think mentors aren't assigned. It's an organic mating process where mentor agrees to mentor a junior person. It doesn't last forever usually. It's usually for a period of time. When I was a captain, I developed a relationship with an officer who later became a 3-star general, and we had worked together several times during my career, named John Vines. And he was the best mentor I've ever seen, because he would not oversteer you, but every time he thought you were going somewhere else, he would ask those Socratic questions. You sure you want to go that direction? Do you think that's the best thing to do? And if sometimes if you were just way out of line, he'd slap you around hard enough so that you paid great attention. But you always felt that he was also there to protect you if something unfair, not to give you nepotistic kind of insulation, but to just look out for you. And we still work together to this day, almost 50 years later. And the reality is he was able to convince me that my welfare was what he was interested in. And many mentors don't do that. You know, most of us think about ourselves first. And if you could step back and say, I really want what's best for you, how do I do that even though it's inconvenient, or those kinds of things? So I've been blessed with several mentors like that, but he was the most notable.
Well, as promised, the last question is a fun one, partially because I don't even know what it means, but it comes from a friend who says you would know what it means. So I'm going to have to read it because it doesn't make sense to me. But how's the cow? And how many gallons in the reservoir on campus? And what are the cultural importance of these questions in shaping those that answer it correctly?
The cultural importance of those is questionable. Those are part of what they call plebe hoop that you had to memorize when you went to West Point. And so the idea was you go to West Point, there's a series of questions. How's a cow? Gallons, and I can't remember the answer to either of them now. But at one point I could. And you had to spout this off, and it was taught under pressure for a new cadet, your first year at West Point, to have an upperclassman yelling at you, firing questions that you then had to remember a verbatim memorized response. And if you couldn't get it, you had problems. One of the ones that they had was Schofield's definition of discipline. And it's brilliant. It says, you know, the discipline that makes soldiers of a free country reliable in battle is not to be gained through harsher tyrannical treatment. Then it goes on. But the idea is some of it had value because they are teaching you good stuff. Some of it is just the discipline and the presence of mind under pressure.
Yeah. Well, I love the answer, and it seems like basically at the end of the day, it's one of those little things that define a culture of an organization, and it sounds like that was the beginning of how they shape leaders in the armed forces. Think under pressure and have a precise answer. Well, with that, thank you for joining us, Stan. I mean, we could have kept on going. There's so much I'd love to ask you, but it was such a pleasure to spend this hour with you and to hear your wisdom and your thoughts. And I look forward to promoting your new book when it's out.
Well, thank you so much, Carlos. It's been a real honor.
Guys, follow the podcast, subscribe, and send to everyone you think this would be valuable for. Until next time, bye.